Well, anyway, now to the more serious stuff at hand. The Society, of course, has a very large collection of stuff. We've got art, paintings, some sculpture, lots of documents, books, what else? Hat molds, quilts, old military uniforms, old sports uniforms, and all kinds of stuff. This is something anybody who wants to come in can see on Saturday morning. And I've seen some of you on there Saturday morning. I'll probably see more of you. But we have a surprisingly interesting collection of weapons, and they go back to the earliest days of Medfield, 1651. One of the weapons that our speakers will be talking about is the very first one. One of the possibly the oldest. It's not a rifle, musket in the Western Hemisphere, but we've been wondering for a long time what to do with them, how to preserve them. Do we have anything that's of any value or not? And we have gotten the answer. I had on the other hand, 3 years ago, there was a guy named Paul Royka who had done work on the Antiques Roadshow, and he came in here and he did a walk-in antique appraisal. And he looked at it and he said, it's a piece of homemade junk, it might be worth $200, but I wouldn't give it to you, or something like that. Turns out he was wrong. But I happened to run into, Adams Shipman is over there, and I ran into him at he refreshed my memory. It was a meeting of kind of a brown bag lunch for people from various historical societies that we have periodically, just to compare notes and see what each other are doing. And somehow the subject of what we call the Mayflower musket came up, and Adams was interested in it and came over and looked at it and said that he thought Joe and Stuart would be interested in it, and indeed they were. But let me before I go into the program intro, I want to remind you that Armed Forces Day, Saturday, May 16th, is the day that the Society has arranged for a tour of the World War II Museum in Natick. And it's open to all paid-up members. And if you're not a paid-up member, you can come, but you've got to pay up. It's $25 if you're not a member, and if you're a senior, you get a $10 membership and $15 to get into the museum. We're going to go over individually in cars because some people will want to stay there much longer than others, I imagine. But I've heard people suggest you budget 2 or 3 hours for this trip. You need to sign a waiver when you go in. We have copies of the waiver there. You can download them, but they ask that you fill out the waiver before you get there so that they don't have a bunch of people lined up waiting to buy tickets while everybody's reading the waiver and signing it. I've thought for a long time that World War II was a bottomless pit of interesting stories. In fact, I wrote about it in the current issue of The Portal, and I had mentioned some of the interesting books that I had read, and one of them was something by Ben McIntyre. It was called Operation Mincemeat, and it's a spy story. It really happened in World War II. Fascinating book, as all of McIntyre's are. And I was flipping through Netflix the other day, and I saw that they had a movie called The Man Who Never Was from the mid-'50s, and it is about Operation Mincemeat. And the opening scene shows a soldier's body washing on the Spanish shore, and the question is, what's he got in the diplomatic pouches? And they build a movie around it, and it's a terrific movie and very timely for going to go to the World War II Museum. I wanted to, now to introduce Stuart. I want to now introduce Stuart and Stuart Mowbray and Joe Pouleo. They publish the magazine that is called Man at Arms. And they are antique weapons experts who came up here and spent a few hours at the Society going through our entire collection and gave us some very interesting and gratifying news on some of them. And thank you very much for coming.
No problem.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to take turns talking about a couple of the items that we came across in the collection. We chose 3 of them for special attention, 2 because they're absolutely amazing, and 1 because it's very typical and tells a nice New England story. And I'm going to start with this Colt Model 1862 police revolver, which is, one of the products developed by Sam Colt's company in Hartford, Connecticut, and very popular manufacturer during the Civil War. They sold a lot of weapons to the government for Army use, but they were also, this model in particular was kind of small and handy, as you can see. And a lot of people, especially officers, would buy these for their own personal sidearms. And often when you went off to war, your friends or maybe your family would get together, they'd raise a little money, and they'd buy you a sword or buy you a gun, just as a little presentation type piece. And in this case, the owner and his unit are marked on the back strap in engraving across the back. And his name was Richard Crown and Shield Derby, and or Darby, I guess, probably how he pronounced it. What do you think? And he was a captain, and what was his unit? It says here, the 15th Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers. And this was one of the earliest units raised in Massachusetts, and therefore they were in the war from the very beginning and had a very long career in it. He was from 2 very prestigious families in this part of the world. The Crown and Shields were from Salem, and the Darbys were local here to Medfield. And he seems to have grown up fairly wealthy. He went to all the good schools, but he ended up being a college dropout, trying to break into business, and then the war broke out, and he was one of the initial volunteers. He went to Boston and signed up to fight for the Union, and eventually became a captain. Now, what's really neat about this guy is that he dies in the war. He's a casualty, and his family arranges to put together a book commemorating his young life. And it was called The Young Captain, and it took together his correspondence, the correspondence of his school friends who went to war with him, any documents they could come across, remembrances of his commanding officers, that sort of thing. So what's really neat about this being in the Society's collection is it's not just a gun with a name. We know probably more about this particular soldier than anyone who fought in that entire regiment. As a matter of fact, when they did the regimental history, they based it almost entirely on his semi-autobiographical work. They were actually in one of the very first episodes of the war, and they were in a battle outside of Washington, and it didn't go well. And I wanted to read a little bit from his letter to his mother about this encounter, and simply because this revolver is actually mentioned in his letter. And he's telling his mother, "It's a mystery to me how any man escaped the shower of bullets that was poured in upon us for 2 hours. The pieces of artillery seemed to be a special target of the sharpshooters, and hardly a man was left standing by them after the second volley." Later he goes on, "Early in the forenoon, Company H had a skirmish of its own account with a company of Mississippi riflemen. We got the better of them, even with our old smoothbore muskets." And what he's referring to is the fact that the Confederates from Mississippi had rifles, and his unit in Company H, they had normal muskets of the percussion variety and couldn't reach out with as great a distance. If you had a rifle, you could basically stay out of the other guy's range and pick him off from a distance, and it could get pretty ugly. So he, even as a young man, just starting off in the beginning of the war, already understood that dynamic. Later, he says, I went through the whole of it without a scratch, not even a hole in my clothes. I was very much disappointed, as some officers had 3 or 4 bullets through their clothes and caps. So I made up for it by nearly drowning myself in the Potomac River. Yeah, this is obviously a highly educated young man with a good sense of humor, making fun of himself to his mother about, the pride of being young and off at war, and really being young and stupid at that point, because the war would become very serious, of course, later on for everyone who was involved in it. And these were still the early heady days when everything seemed like it was a big camping trip with death. But the interesting thing is to get away from the fact that his unit had been driven out by the Confederates. He had to swim across the river. And were trying to escape to an island. And so what he did is he took his equipment and put it on a raft and then used it like a kickboard and kicked his way through the current and was able to escape and wasn't captured as a result. And he literally says, so I pulled off my boots and laid my sword, my pistol, and belt on a small board and pushed across. I was anxious to save my sword as it looked too much like surrendering to lose that. And the neat thing is that on the frontispiece of the book, you can come up and look at it later, but here he is with his pistol and his sword and his little kickboard making his way across the river in that incident. And that's this pistol that he's referring to. Now, I think it's a great book, and it's available free on the internet. You can read it right on your screens. It's called The Young Captain. And I'm only going to go over one more incident from that just because it refers to how he was killed. And again, the pistol is mentioned. And it's a slightly long quotation, but this is from his best friend telling Richard's mother that he'd been killed. And one of the things that really comes across in Civil War diaries and reminiscences and stuff like that is just how emotional they were and how men interacted with each other in ways that wouldn't be common today. As far as they were much more touchy-feely. They were they talked in great emotion about their love for their comrades. And it's something that comes across to the modern reader as a little strange, but it was typical of Victorian times. And this is the young man who survived talking about the owner of the pistol and how he passed away. He said, we left camp, this is at the Battle of Antietam, by the way, we left camp in cheerful spirits, though with something like a premonition that great events were at hand. I chatted pleasantly with Richard, who was almost a brother to me, and we went forward hand in hand, as we had often done before. So here they're literally locking their hands in each other's, marching towards the enemy to calm each other down, these two officers. And he said, when we approached the enemy, he asked me to attend to the men on the right of the company, while he gave orders to those on the left. In a moment, heavy volleys were poured into our ranks, and finding myself slightly wounded, I sought the shelter of a tree. While binding my wound, I saw the lieutenant, that's the owner of the pistol, cheering on his men in the most heroic manner. It was a scene that I can never forget. 2 minutes later, he also was laid at the foot of the tree, fatally wounded in the temple. He was quite unconscious, apparently in almost like a childlike sleep, and thus without suffering, he passed from life to immortality. Oh, how sadly did his dear friend Major Philbrick and myself gaze upon his fair face. We exchanged significant and sorrowful glances, and looking at the battle before us, we found ourselves nearly surrounded by the enemy. Hastily retreating, we were obliged to leave our dead and wounded. But before this, I had secured everything of value about our dear brother, except his sword belt, which was so firmly fastened that I could not secure it. So here his close friend has been killed, wants to be able to bring the body back to the family in Massachusetts, ends up just being able to take his most valuable possessions that he could find because they had to flee. By the time they come back, all the bodies had become bloated in the sun and were almost unrecognizable. And they decided that they weren't going to be able to bring the bodies back to Massachusetts. They were in just too deplorable a state. So they buried them in a mass grave, and that's where they stay today. in what he described as a small gardeny area near the battlefield where he fell. And then a couple of days further on, the letter continues. Yesterday, Major Philbrick and myself, with the aid of a borrowed key, his own being lost, unlocked the captain's valise and placed in it his watch, pistol, gold ring, and other articles of value. Today I have directed this to you. So his mother sees that her cherished son's pistol ends up here for us to look at today. Part of Medfield's history, and really quite a story. You don't often look at a weapon like this in a collection and then say, oh, there's a 300-page book about the guy.
Yeah.
Very unusual, and it makes it quite special.
Okay. So the next part of this, most of the guns in this collection are long guns. These can be muskets or, for the most part, they're muskets or followers. And I'm going to do this in reverse chronological order. We'll start with the newest one. Because the newest one is actually a reflection of the New England Militia System, which flourished here, flourished all over the state, flourished all over New England. The militia system is something that's actually quite poorly understood. It was not, they were not freestanding military units that were expected to go into action together. The militia system in New England, beginning in the 17th century, and we'll get to that when we talk about this really ancient musket that you have here, is effectively a kind of popular military training system. People, the militia, service in the militia was absolutely mandatory through the entire period. Actually, the law under which it was mandatory wasn't revoked until 1912. You were eligible for militia service in New England from the age of about 16 to about 60. Absolutely every male citizen had this requirement, and there were virtually no exceptions. And when I say no exceptions, there were long lists of exceptions. Ferry keepers, clergymen, things of that nature. But exemption from militia service did not exempt you from the requirement to be armed. So virtually everybody was armed. So let's start with the very end of the system. And that's this guy right here, which is a very ordinary, what collectors call a, quote, New England militia musket. They call it that because they really don't have anything else to call it. The period term, interestingly enough, is a training musket. And it comes from the expression training day, which was the 3 or 4 times a year annual militia training exercise that everybody had to attend. This one is actually, the lock of the gun is English made. The gun itself can be nominally considered American made. The barrel was made in Massachusetts. It was inspected by a man named Luke Harrington in 1836, which makes it quite late. It's proved under the Massachusetts militia laws. The barrel was made by Azel Waters in Millbury, Massachusetts. So this is the fully developed militia system. But it goes back to right after the Revolutionary War. The Militia Acts, the first Militia Act is in 1792, and the militia system as it developed in the independent United States of America dates to that. This guy right here is actually a really good example of a 1792 period militia musket. Keep in mind, it's 40 years older than this one. They look quite a bit alike, but it's actually quite a bit older. In this case, we've got a lock and a trigger guard and a butt plate from a German musket, maybe a Dutch musket, from maybe 1750. I don't know when the barrel is probably not quite that old, and all the rest of the mounts are much later. It's fitted on the end, you'll see, see this little projection on the bottom of the barrel. It's a bayonet lug. In order to be useful for militia service, every single gun had to have a bayonet, and that was absolute requirement. You were fined if you didn't have a bayonet. So the barrel has to be, the stock has to be cut back that far, and there has to be a little lug here for the bayonet to attach to. Go back even further. And this is one of the things I like about this collection, because this has actually got examples from, 30-year intervals all the way back to the 17th century. Go back a little bit further, and we have this guy right here, which is even better, because this gun is French. And it's a souvenir of the 7 Years' War, or what we call the French and Indian War. It probably dates from 1710, 1720. It's French made, it's iron mounted. It wasn't a musket at all, it's a fowling piece. In other words, it's a gun for shooting birds and things of that nature, but it's been modified by having the stock cut back and this little lug added to it so they could put a bayonet on. This is probably a perfect example of a gun that came back from the 7 Years' War as a souvenir and continued to be used in militia service, maybe, all the way up. It could have been used as late as the 1830s. It could have actually had, it could have been 100 years old and still been in everyday use. One of the aspects that we tend to forget about the 7 Years' War, it's one of my favorite subjects actually, is the fact that we tend to think of it as a prelude to the Revolution. Whereas at the time, they thought of it, the Revolution, as the sequel to the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War, or what in Europe is called the 7 Years' War, was infinitely a larger conflict. There's a very, very good book called Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors.
That's one of them, but are you thinking of Anderson's People?
That's the one. Oh, People's Army, yes. Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors is the subtitle. This gentleman, Fred Anderson, who's a very competent historian, estimates that something in the neighborhood of 75% of the men in Massachusetts who were eligible for military service served in the 7 Years' War at some time. This between 1759 and 1757 and 1763. It means overwhelming percentage served at some point. And a much larger percentage than served in the Revolutionary War. These are actually the generation that led the soldiers in the Revolutionary War, and they're basically the fathers of most of the Revolutionary War soldiers. They all had this service. So it's a terribly, terribly important period, which by and large gets overlooked. I think I lost track of where I was going with this one. Go ahead.
I remember from high school European history, the 7 Years' War, but I can't
Yes.
remember who was fighting it.
All right, Winston Churchill called it the First World War. It was literally fought from from central Pennsylvania to India. It was absolutely huge. Involved hundreds of thousands of people.
France and Great Britain.
Between France and Britain, yes. So the upshot of this is a very special little collection of stuff, because it covers some very, very important periods. And it's really good, what should I say? They're very good very ordinary examples of things that we don't commonly see. In any case, the best part of the collection is this 17th century musket, which Stuart's going to talk to you about, because Stuart's better at 17th century guns than I am. But it actually is a reflection of the very beginning of the system. Now, this whole militia system in New England evolves from the middle of the 17th century forward. It's completely different from the English system. In the English system, the Crown always retained the ownership of weapons. In fact, since the Middle Ages, the British government has done its best to keep the general population from being armed. In America, it was completely the opposite. So basically, there wasn't any standing army, so there wasn't any real choice but to have the general population armed if people were going to protect themselves. So we end up with a kind of mirror image of the medieval English system, which develops into an American system that's completely different from any place else in the world, as far as I know. And this guy right here is perhaps the oldest musket in America. I mean, think about that. There have been hundreds of thousands of these things. This might be the very oldest one. There are 3 other guns of this vintage that we know of. 2 of them are Fowlers, and one's a wheel-lock. So this is the only flintlock musket that we know of that's anywhere near this old. All yours?
What makes it special is that it's a military weapon. What tends to happen when things get saved over time is the fancy stuff gets saved and the everyday stuff just disappears. And this musket was everyday stuff. This is the type of thing that a person serving in his town's militia force would have used to defend him and the houses of his neighborhood. And they tended to use them up. They would update them. They would repair them. It was a commodity. It wasn't meant to look fancy. It was just meant to work. So you have this tool. And the thing is that out here in the colonies, well, heck, they didn't have gunsmiths. They didn't have a way to buy more muskets once they wore the old one out. So when we got the call to come up and look at this, they said, oh, we have a Mayflower gun. And we're like, yeah, right. Because we get lots of calls of that type. And it's always some blunderbuss that would be used to hunt a turkey in a bad cartoon about Thanksgiving. You know, it's never what it should actually be, which is a beat-up, built from parts, serviceable musket of the exact perfect vintage. There are at least 3 or 4 generations going on here of features. The barrel is from what we call a matchlock. And that is where you essentially, all that happens when you pull the trigger is there's a little wick, and it goes down, and it lights off the gunpowder, and it goes boom, essentially. It's no more sophisticated than the most primitive firework you could imagine. But it worked. So, okay, the barrel's from that. And then the stock is from what's called a snap-ons, which is the earliest kind of flintlock. But after a while, that got obsolete. And they upgraded it again. Now, this is something that would never, ever happen in Europe, right? You know, they just get a new gun. But here in Massachusetts, you know, you get what you get. You know, you have to make it keep working. So they took this lock, which is something called an English lock, and pop it in this gun. And this is happening all over English America during the 1640s. And you see it being done in Virginia, you see it being done in Massachusetts, you see it being done in Maryland. You do not see this being done in Europe. So when we looked at this and said, okay, all these recycled bits, it's beat to hell. It's got the most pathetic, unskilled repair work done to it you can possibly imagine. It's got this ugly trigger that doesn't even fit your finger. I mean, that's got to be replaced.
Exactly right.
Yeah, it's such a piece of junk, it's perfect. So, instantly, of course, we went to you and said, okay, what's the record on this thing? Who owned it? And in 1918, it was donated to the public library, which was at that time just being opened. And the public library donates it to the Historical Society. And the notes said that it had originally been donated sometime in the 1800s by a Stephen Turner. And there's a lot of Turners in Medfield, or at least there were back then. And they were all politicians and public figures. It seems to have been a very successful family. They owned a lot of land. So it makes sense that a Turner would have been donating an old family heirloom to the public buildings of the town to save it. So you go to Ancestry.com, you do the genealogy of the guy, and you find out that his direct male line descendant is John Turner, one of the 13 first founders of Medfield in 1649, 1650, right at the time when guns were being built with these replacement locks that I told you about. So this was getting interesting. And then I noticed the initials, JT, John Turner. It's not proof, but it's pretty good. Especially since I didn't start out with the initials and work towards trying to figure out who JT might have been. It's much more convincing, at least to me, if I figure out, well, there's this guy, John Turner. It might have been his gun. Oh, JT, great. So I called my friends down at Jamestown. We do some work with the head archaeologist there, and I sort of ran it all by her, and she took a look at all the pictures and everything, and she's looked at all kinds of muskets from this era, parts of muskets from this era, and like Joe said, she's in agreement that this is the oldest intact military firearm that saw American use that we know of at this point. Everything else is either a part, came out of the ground and only the iron bits are there, but it doesn't actually survive as a gun. Now you can go to Pilgrim Hall out in Plymouth, and yes, they have some guns that were owned by the Pilgrims, but they were civilian arms, not a common man's musket. And the fact that they need to arm themselves really has to be stressed here. Medfield was dangerous ground when it was settled. There were Indians everywhere. It was distant from Boston. This was the Wild West. This was the frontier. The mean streets of Medfield. It's hard to imagine, when I'm eating over at Zebra that, people were terrified to live here. People would say, why the hell would you do that? And Turner was born in England. He came here very early on. He settled in Roxbury, and then he's one of the initial land grant settlers here in Medfield. And his daughter, just to show why they needed this, during King Philip's War, his daughter was killed by Indians when Medfield was attacked. And it's a fairly famous incident. And I just wanted to read you one quick paragraph describing it, because this is one of those big iconic events that shows up in Medfield histories over and over again. And the earliest account I could find reads like this. When the Indians made their attack upon the town, Elizabeth took her youngest child, then 1.5 years, in her arms and ran towards the fort. When a little way from the house, the savages overtook her and killed her with a blow to the head. The child, Samuel Jr., was thrown on the ground, stunned and left for dead, but recovered consciousness and when found had crept to the dead body of his mother. And the town was decimated by this attack. But they rebuilt. The next year, her husband, exactly 1 year from her death, married the widow of a man who had been killed in the attack. And Medfield muddled on. And I honestly think this gun was here. And that's pretty cool. Thank you very much.
You're talking about military weapons, but did they also use these for hunting?
Yes. There's relatively little difference. In fact, well, in the case of the French musket, it is a hunting weapon made into a military musket, but just as often they would have used the military muskets to hunt with, but there was a lot less hunting than people think there was. By 1820, virtually all of this land was clear. I think the statistic I've read is that in 1820, 85% of Massachusetts was clear. Today, 15% of it's clear. There was no game left to hunt. There were no deer or anything like that. They were all gone by the end of the 18th century. So what hunting was done was the odd birds or nuisance animals, things of that nature. In sort of traditional American history, it's very much overemphasized as far as the East Coast is concerned. This part of the world was very civilized by then. So by far and away, the majority of surviving guns are actually military guns because the requirement to be armed for the militia never went away. It didn't go away until 1842. But the necessity to hunt, or the interest in hunting, was probably not very high from the middle of the 18th century on.
What about the swords?
Oh yes, we have two good swords. Well, we have two. We have one good sword and one sword that we brought because it's an example of something that's not worth anything. And that's this guy, which is basically it's a GAR sword. It's something that was incredibly inexpensive. This one, let's see, I can even read the name on it. But they were all made by the same 3 or 4 companies. This one says William Reed and Sons, Boston. William Reed and Sons were big military surplus, and they were actually big gun dealers. But they sold all sorts of surplus stuff. And they supplied the GAR, and they sold regular uniforms and army swords and things of that nature. But that sword probably cost $5 in 1875 or 80. This guy, on the other hand, is pretty special. This is a Nathan Starr 1808 contract cutlass. So it was made by Nathan Starr in Middletown, Connecticut, for the United States Navy under a contract, and I could be corrected on this. I think that the contract was for either like 1,250 or 2,000 of them. They were made for the Navy before the War of 1812. Well, practically none of them have survived, for the simple reason that we lost practically all our ships in the War of 1812. We always hear about the Constitution and the Guerriere and this wonderful, War of 1812 was the big high point for the United States Navy, but they very rarely mention the fact that about 85 or 90% of the ships that were in the Navy when the war began were sunk or captured during the war. The result is that practically all the 1808 Star cutlasses are either on the bottom of the ocean someplace or they're in England. So it's actually a very special thing. I don't think there are any more than 10 or 12 of them known. They are a known number. I think Stuart owns 2 of them. But they're a pretty special thing to have. And they're unquestionably a War of 1812 vintage. This relic of the Navy. How about anything else? Yes?
I've got a question about the pistol.
Yes.
Does it have a brass frame?
No. It has a forged iron frame. Actually, it's forged. It's probably forged steel. It has a brass backstrap. The only brass frame percussion pistols made in the 80s were the ones that the Confederates made. And all that was only because they couldn't work iron.
Some number of years ago, 4, 5, 6, at a Medfield Day, the Historical Society had a little table out with several items, and one of them was a pistol, Colt, and I was impressed at that time because it had a brass frame, and I was wondering how and why Derby, whose gun it was alleged to be, would have had a brass frame Colt.
He wouldn't.
So then, Something was wrong with the display.
Yes, something was definitely wrong with that. Brass frame ones have been around for about 40 years now. They're made as reproductions. The real ones are actually very rare. They didn't survive very well, and they weren't very durable at the time.
This was not a,
If it was a real old one. Now, here's an interesting comment about Confederate stuff like that. The best place in the whole country to find really good Confederate relics is New England. Not the South, because in the South they got used up. In New England, they got brought home as souvenirs, and people just put them away in the sock drawer and left them there. So, for instance, there's a colleague of ours who has a fabulous collection of Civil War Confederate Navy stuff. I mean, the Confederate Army's hard enough to collect. Try collecting the Confederate Navy. Practically all of it comes from New England, where it came home as souvenirs with, you know, Navy sailors. They didn't need it. They didn't need to cut the hedges with a Confederate cutlass. They took it home and they hung it up in the GAR hall, or they kept it in the closet, or they showed it off to their grandchildren, and the stuff is still around. One of these comments, a comment I'd make about the French musket is, and this is another real curiosity, the best place on the earth to find 18th century French guns is New England. Not in France. They haven't survived in France. They haven't survived in Canada. The only place they've survived is in any significant number is New England. So this is really the right place to be if you like flintlocks.
I had a question, perhaps part of the society, then directly to you gentlemen, but in the society, how are these weapons being preserved?
Well, that would be Mr. Temple's purview, but we did give him some advice, and basically, which is sort of like, don't touch them. You know, clean them up, wipe them off. You know, you keep the active rust off them in the dirt, but quite frankly, I wouldn't do much more to them than that. It's a colossal mistake to start polishing them up. So, and we took a look at what they had. It seemed to me that it was reasonably adequate. I mean, basically, as long as it's not, you know, there's not too much moisture or too much anything. They're pretty stable things. I mean, we're talking about stuff that's 350 years old, so, or some of it. It's lasted a long time. It'll go on as long as it's not abused. It'll last practically forever.
That was one of the best things about the visit, to realize that unwittingly we've been doing the right thing.
Yes, yeah. Well, when in doubt, do nothing.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how it was actually loaded and fired and what went into actually using it?
That's actually what the whole business behind the militia is. The militia was not, I was saying, they were not active military unit. They were a basic training unit. It's sort of community-based Army basic training. There were things you had to know how to do. Muskets are loaded by a very, very strict and very regulated drill. So, for instance, we'll take the least of them, like this. The guy would stand there, he'd have a belt over his shoulder or a box on his waist that would have a paper cartridge in it. He'd take the cartridge out, tear the end off with his teeth, dump the powder into the barrel. Actually, I might be wrong about that. Tear the end off it with his teeth, go up here, push this little bit forward, put a little gunpowder in there, and push it back. Then he'd put it up, pour the rest of the gunpowder in, stuff the paper and the bullet down the barrel, take out the ramrod and ram the whole thing down. As complicated as that sounds, really well-trained troops could do this 3 or 4 times in a minute. They were but that's why they had to drill and drill and drill and drill. It was a real skill to learn to do all these things quickly enough. Then the gun was basically pointed at the enemy, it was cocked and it was fired. When it was fired, this guy right here is called the battery. Modern term is the prison, which is a completely modern term. the cock had a piece of flint in it. When the cock came down, the flint hit this, made sparks, and threw it open at the same time. The sparks ignited the gunpowder in the flash pan. That ignited the gunpowder in the barrel. All of this happens faster than you can't discern the time. It literally appears to be instantaneous. It isn't actually instantaneous. There's a few tenths of a second, but it happens so quickly that you would never be able to. When it's properly functioning, you won't be able to tell what happened first. But that's basically it. You just had to learn to do all these things very quickly, and everybody together.
How far and how accurate?
Effective range for a smoothbore musket was probably 120, 130 yards. They would carry a great deal further, but it doesn't make much difference because they didn't aim them. They weren't really, the whole notion of marksmanship hadn't been invented. They were using the principle that they wanted to lay down. And this is one of the things that people don't really understand about 18th century warfare when they are critical of the fact that they stood in great lines and fired in volleys. Well, it's actually no different than modern warfare. What they were trying to do was lay down a great field of fire. The only way they could do it in the 18th century was to have everybody stand shoulder to shoulder. Today we have automatic weapons and guys can spread out and do exactly the same thing. Well, they couldn't do that, as I said, they couldn't do it in the 18th century. So they fired in volleys. And the idea was to get as many bullets in the air as fast as possible. They put bayonets on the guns because at the end you fired a volley and then you charged. And if you charged and you did it properly, it took a certain amount of time. It was all very mathematical. It took a certain amount of time to reload the muskets. If you're 100 yards from your enemy, and he can only fire 2 shots, while you advance that 100 yards, you fix your bayonets and charge him, and he's kind of stuck. He can't fire fast enough to stop you. So, but this is what required, this is, for instance, this is the kind of iron discipline of the British Army. These guys could stand there and take those volleys and not react, and then charge when they were told to charge. It's one of the reasons it took quite a long time for the Americans to come up with the Continental Army that could actually stand a bayonet charge. It's one of the reasons that riflemen were almost useless in anything other than skirmishing purposes because they had no bayonets. The minute the British saw riflemen out, they would deploy, they would just send out the light infantry and charge them with bayonets because they'd run away. So, anyhow, anything else? Yeah.
Your description of how he loaded the flintlock there is a little different from what we typically see in the movies. I saw the Black Hole Heatons recently.
Yeah, well, the thing is, in the movies they're actually constrained to do it the safe way, the way we would do it today at a rifle range. The fact of the matter is, you shouldn't be priming the gun before you load the barrel, but that's how they really did it.
Well, first I was going to ask you was,
yeah.
You always, the typical, you see, the first thing that you tend to see them do when they're going to be loaded, they grab the powder horn and pull the cork out of the powder horn.
Yes.
You didn't.
Well, military muskets didn't. Soldiers didn't carry powder horns.
Okay.
Soldiers carried paper cartridges, wrapped paper cartridges. The powder horn is really a civilian thing. Now, I'm not saying it didn't occasionally happen, but as a general rule, you would only do that if you couldn't possibly get paper cartridges.
The Massimo Higgins, they were civilians. So.
Yeah, exactly. They're civilians. So.
Yeah, who's supplying? I mean, how are they getting the paper cartridges?
They make them.
They're making it.
Yeah.
Who's paying?
It's very simple.
Right. Who's paying for that? Is the towns?
Oh, the guys have had to make their own. In fact, under the Militia Act, you had to have your own 16 cartridges.
Okay.
But they're very simple to make. All they are is a tube of. Basically, they made them out of newspaper. I mean, I've owned cartridge boxes where the pieces of the cartridges were still in the boxes. And they're wrapped up, they were wrapped up out of newspapers that were printed in Boston in 1810. You took an old piece of paper, you had a stick of some sort, and you rolled a piece of paper over it, you stuck a bullet in it, you tied the ends off, put the gunpowder in, tied the ends off, and you were all done. Very simple to make.
In full-out warfare, they do that in a more organized way. The government.
Yeah, governments did. In fact, most of the paper cartridges the British Army used were made by girls.
But these guns we're talking about here wouldn't have been used by a standing army. These were for local troops guarding the streets, and that would have been the way they would approach it. Whereas, like Joe was saying, with regular soldiers, everything from their clothing to their underwear to their hats, it was all supplied to them. Interestingly, they take it out of their pay.
Yeah.
Well,
sometimes it was a punishment duty to make cartridges.
So,
It was actually kind of a crazy thing to do. You know?
If anybody has any additional questions, we'd like to take them, but we'd also like to give people an opportunity to take a closer look. So thank you very much, and
Thank you.
come take a look at
Production support provided by Medfield.tv. Access to our community.